Welcome back. Today we're going to look at the politics of righting past wrongs, or the various aspects that come into play when we talk about transitional justice. We can define transitional justice as a new, or often nominally new regime's legal and symbolic responses to past human rights violations. And when I say nominally new, I just want to emphasize here that oftentimes when we have democratization processes that begin, they don't always end the way we expect them to, as in democracy. So a new regime or a new government within a regime will call itself a new democracy, and then it won't actually go through with democratic consolidation. So transitional justice is still a policy option with many regimes that pretend to be democracies, but just keep in mind that although we assume democratic leaders, that's not always the case. Really, anyone can point to the abuses of predecessors, even those who are continuing abuses today. And in fact, what we've seen historically is that many dictators, even those who haven't pretended to be democracies, have tried to separate themselves from the old dictatorship by talking about human rights violations. When we talk about transitional justice, we're not always talking about, we're not at all really talking about revenge per se. It's about strengthening the rule of law, but this could involve an element of revenge. That may well be a motivation among some people in the new government who suffered and have now taken power. Finally, transitional justice is usually focused on core rights violations. When we talk about core human rights violations, we're talking about the big four: arbitrary detention, torture, disappearances, and extralegal murder. So at least on paper and in studies, there tends to be a focus on these core rights violations. What I've found in reality is that, and this is something largely unaddressed in the literature, is that there are often cases that are focused on things like corruption and other economic crimes that are the things that hit the people, broadly speaking, most saliently. And many new elites focus on these things as well. But when we talk about transitional justice in the literature from a Western perspective, we usually talk about justice for the worst of the worst violations, and worst of the worst being defined in the West as well, murder is pretty bad. But you have to remember that in many societies where economic rights are critical in order to survive, a lack of economic rights is also in effect murder. If you don't have, if people are deprived, for example, of a place to live, then they can die in the elements. If people are deprived of a means of work, then they're going to die of starvation. But again, in transitional justice studies, we tend to focus on those core political civil rights violations. Studies of transitional justice are frequently centered on or around the threat of criminal justice, rooted in this logic that passing out criminal sentences today is going to somehow deter human rights violations tomorrow. Because the dictatorships who next take power, or the democratic regimes, whoever it is, whoever's in power is going to see that if they do something that violates human rights, then they could well be held accountable and face the court of law for this sometime in the future. And so this is supposed to deter them and make them think twice before they do that. This whole deterrence thing is really hard to prove. I mean, it's a counterfactual. What would have happened if we had done these policies, if we hadn't done these policies? But the deterrence argument did help bring transitional justice into the international sphere. Now, there's a long list of reasons that elites pursue transitional justice, besides deterrence. This could be to signal the start of institutional reforms, so to further the rule of law, due process. In other words, do things that help avoid the repetition of past rights violations. It could be to demonstrate that all citizens are liable under the same law. So there's accountability, there's punishment. There is no one person stands above everybody else and can get away with things that no one else can. It could encourage public support for previously absent democratic values. When we talked about political culture, we talked a little bit about democratic values. So values like equality, participation, these are the sorts of things that justice can help to push onto society. Justice can also help forge a common historical understanding. For example, you establish truth. This might include providing a public platform for victims, encouraging public deliberation about what happened. So create this common historical understanding so that everyone's on the same page. It can demonstrate a new elite's institutional disapproval of rights violations. We categorically hold these abuses to be criminal. It can also enable a new government to enhance its own legitimacy by really constructing a wall between itself and the former regime. So saying we are definitely not what they were. All of these help to contribute to two broad overarching objectives: societal reconciliation and democratic consolidation. And so it's thought that by individualizing victims, by saying that he or she was responsible for those particular abuses, so these perpetrators, justice policies can eradicate the danger of collective guilt, which can lead to long-term instability. So if we don't single out the individuals and say that they were responsible, this individual was responsible for these rights violations, then people might look at an entire class or an entire ethnic group or an entire religious group or an entire race and say that they were all collectively responsible for these rights violations. The point of transitional justice is to stop and say, no, these individuals did it. No one else was responsible for this. Now, there are varying degrees of responsibility and guilt. If you take the transitional justice class that I teach, we can talk about those in more detail. But generally speaking, the idea of transitional justice, one main idea, is that if you individualize guilt and criminal responsibility or responsibility in general, then it frees the collective. It frees people from collective guilt and lowers the risk of long-term instability that can happen with collective guilt because people, it'll be group against group. Okay? So by reconciliation, we mean a, quote, process through which a society moves from a divided past to a shared future. And this can be everything from bare coexistence to all-out forgiveness. Reconciliation is the transformation of post-conflict society from antagonism and distrust, this relationship between people, to respect and cooperation between peoples. Again, restoring the horizontal ties that might have been somehow dashed or attacked by the former regime. Sometimes this is referred to as a form of quote-unquote social repair. So post-conflict societies are broken, they're dysfunctional, and they need to be fixed for democracy to take root. Reconciliation takes place on two levels. We can talk about individual and societal reconciliation. At the individual level, we're talking about getting rid of personal hostility and guilt. Right? We just talked about guilt. Get rid of that personal hostility between people. Throw away the guilt that might exist and that might somehow encumber the relationships that are meant to develop. But societal reconciliation, we mean reconstructing relations within communities and also between political groups and factions. So this is sort of the group level, societal level. Reconciliation is often touted as a critical ingredient to the second broad goal here, which is democratic consolidation. Democratic consolidation involves the creation of institutions that both politicians and their public support. That's what we mean by democratic consolidation. So it involves the rule of law, where everyone's equal before the law and follows the rules, or it's clear that they will be punished. But it involves a lot more. So it's democratic consolidation is basically, again, the short way of approaching democratic consolidation is it's when all the democratic institutions are in place and people all respect those institutions. And everyone plays by the new democratic rules of the game. So reconciliation and democratic consolidation can be very closely linked, because without reconciliation, many say that you will not get democratic consolidation. And without democratic consolidation, that opens up a route by which a lack of reconciliation can occur, because these groups can end up fighting each other in the political contest, and this can open up old wounds that can stop reconciliation from occurring. So it's important to remember that transitional justice encompasses much more than just criminal prosecutions. And we can broadly categorize justice policies into restorative and retributive mechanisms. By restorative justice, we're talking about ameliorating the pain of victims and families. So examples of restorative justice, these are victim-oriented justice policies, include rehabilitation, so restoring the legal status of an individual, whether that individual is dead. For example, someone was sentenced to death under the old regime for something bogus. Well, now you go back and you posthumously claim that they were, or declare that they were in fact innocent. It could be for people currently. Maybe some of them can't even vote today because they were declared criminals. That's rehabilitation. Compensation, so paying people for their pain, Truth investigations, which gives the victims a right to stand up and talk about their stories and talk about what happened to them, which is important when they're coming out of a regime where people weren't allowed to even acknowledge the abuses and no one believed them.